All right, well, good morning. You're in the right place if you're here to see the FusionReactor webinar on getting started with FusionReactor. And my name is Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your guide for the next hour or so. And as many of you probably already know, I'm an independent consultant. I work for myself. You can find out more about me at my site, carehart.org. But I'm a big fan of FusionReactor, love showing it to people, help people use it every day, and I've been doing so for the past 10 years. And so, as some of you know, I love to give talks at conferences for Integral and now doing these webinars for them, and doing videos and contributing in other ways. So big fan, love the tool, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you folks. Now, this is a getting started presentation, so this is really geared to people who've not used it before. It's not really an intermediate advanced. That we'll talk about other webinars later with more topics. But hey, even if you've been using it for a while, you'll still probably get value out of some things that maybe you didn't know were possible, that some people need to know even just to get started with it. So we're going to start with a quick review and overview of FusionReactor, just a couple minutes of some perspective setting. And then we'll dive right into installing it and activating it. And we'll talk about the processes of both available automatic installing and manual installing, and automatic activation and manual activation. Now, some of you never have to deal with the manual, but some of you will have to, so you ought to know about it, and we'll cover that in this talk. And then we'll talk about initial setup. And sometimes this throws people because they get it installed, but they don't do the vital next step of getting it configured into the instance that they want to monitor, whatever it is they want to monitor. They need to go one more step. And the installer tries to help you with that, but people seem to miss it. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing this, is to help make it clear to people that there's really two steps of getting it installed. And then we'll proceed to the next step of actually accessing the FusionReactor interface and using it. And then in the remaining time, we'll just cover some basic features. Again, this is not all about how to use FusionReactor, because we'll have used up most of the time just getting to this point. But we'll talk about a few key features that you want to be aware of, and again, point you to resources for learning more. And in particular, other webinars that either have been done or will be done in the future, and they'll dive into various other ways of using FusionReactor. Okay, so again, this is really just for getting started, truly getting started. And we'll end with questions and answers, of course. So just as that overview, I just want to clarify, so FusionReactor is an application performance monitor, and people maybe hear that term APM, and it is a monitor, yes, but I want to clarify that it's more than just a monitor, and we won't in this talk necessarily get to demonstrate that too much. But it is more than a monitor. FusionReactor really has a lot of unique features that other APM tools don't offer, and that's one of the reasons I've loved it from the beginning, and it just gets better and better all the time. I also want to clarify, and if you read the introduction, you saw the reference to Java, and maybe some of you thought, wait, I'm going to use it for something like CFML engine, Cold Fusion, whatever. So FusionReactor can be used with any Java-based application or application server. So it can be Tomcat, JBoss, Wildfly, WebSphere, Jetty, whatever, and applications that you may develop yourself with stuff like Spring and, of course, JSP and servlets, or apps that you might find and download like Solar and Confluence and caching solutions. So anything that's got a request response sort of thing, that's what FusionReactor is good at, and you might be surprised to find that things like even Solar, which is a text search engine, it's included with Cold Fusion, is really a Java application, and you could monitor it with FusionReactor. But back to Cold Fusion, in case any of you are listening who are just Java people, Cold Fusion is a web application server platform, and it's under the covers all Java. And there's open source alternative engines called Lucy and Rilo and Blue Dragon, and FusionReactor can monitor all these things. That's what I want to clarify, is that FusionReactor can monitor all of these things. And just to give you some background, I've said it's over 10 years old. It actually launched in December of 2005, so we're approaching 11 years, actually. And FusionReactor 6, the latest major release, came out just over a year ago, and there have been several updates since then. There's been a 6.1 and then a 6.2, and it's on 6.2.6 as of last week. And if any of you are currently using FusionReactor and you have not yet upgraded to 6.2.6, you really ought to. And if you're on a 6 version, it'll be free. And then others, it would be free if you're on 5 or earlier or 6 or earlier, be free based on having maintenance. But anyway, I'll leave you to discuss that with other folks later. I'll give you contact information at the end for asking questions like that that may go beyond the scope of this presentation. But I also want to clarify that FusionReactor is not some, not only is it not new, but it's also not lightly used by only a few people. It's implemented on 30,000 servers worldwide. Just a second, I'm getting a comment from somebody that's related to the presentation. Oh, well, I was downloading it. You heard that part. I mean, that was all pretty easy. You could see I was downloading it. I was explaining the different options in the download page. This is the manual option. This is the automatic option. And I just downloaded it and ran it. So that part was all pretty straightforward. And I was explaining how, as the installer was running, it was implementing what's called the FRAM service. So let me just repeat that point. There's two parts to FusionReactor's installation. The first part doesn't touch whatever application server you want to monitor. So if you're using ColdFusion or Tomcat or Rilo, doesn't matter. It doesn't touch that. FusionReactor's installer doesn't touch that. Sorry, I'm saying. David, I don't know what this is you're referring to. Go ahead and explain that. But anyway, so when you install FusionReactor, what gets installed first is this thing called FRAM, FusionReactor Administration Manager. And that is a service in Windows or the daemon in Linux. And it's running now as a service. If I were to look at services, I would see that it's now in there as FusionReactor AM service or FusionReactor Administrative Manager service. So this has not yet touched my ColdFusion. I've just implemented this. And you saw, perhaps if you were paying attention, there was a prompt on the screen that said this was going to listen at port 8087. I let it go ahead and be at port 8087. All right, and now this is the point where I think some people seem to stop and they think, well, I've got FusionReactor installed. But you've only got it halfway installed. Maybe they even can click this button and it asks what browser you want to launch in. And I'm going to go ahead and launch it in Internet Explorer just because I know a lot of people are on Windows servers and they do use Internet Explorer, and sometimes quirky things happen with Internet Explorer. So first you'll get these prompts, and if you choose to ignore them or whatever, you might get into trouble. You should add this to trusted sites. If you don't, certain things may not work. JavaScript won't run, things like that. So let me just clarify. You should add that. And if you've not done this before, you'd want to usually uncheck this because a lot of pages don't use HTTPS. This just says, does it have to use HTTPS? No, it doesn't have to. And that's that. So having done that, I just wanted to get that out of the way. Now you see a login. And I was asked during the installer what password to use, and I was saying you can use whatever password you want. And I'll go ahead and log in. And I'll just point out before I log in that you can see that there is a version number indicated here, and that's great, so you can always know what version you're on. Now, once I get into FusionReactor's interface, and I'll go ahead and maximize the display of this, the first time you install it, there is no license installed. Now, again, I don't remember where we were when the audio cut out, but I was explaining that when you do the download, and again, I really apologize for the confusion. We'll make this all clear in the next presentation of the webinar. But when you do the download, you normally would get prompted with the screen that asks for your basic contact information and especially your email address. And you'll be emailed a license key, a trial license key. I was doing a trial. It's a 14-day free trial. You would also be offered that license key on the screen. Now, again, you couldn't hear me telling you this, but I was explaining that the reason I didn't see that prompt for information and also the display of the license key was that I had already downloaded it on this machine. I wasn't thinking about the fact that that process wouldn't show it to me again if it knew that I'd already been here before. Should have tried it with a different browser, that would have solved it. But anyway, the point is, I have the key, I have the email. I just want you to understand that you would get the email and you would have been shown a key, and that's what it's now waiting for, is that license key. So give me just a moment to go get that key. Okay, and the point is you drop that key in here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and, whoops, a little problem with copy-paste across remote desktop. Just a second. Did this fine in testing, so that shouldn't be a problem. Just must have been a keyboard. There you go. Now, before I hit this, I just want to point out, we'll get back to this in a moment, this is going to do what's called activation. It's going to send a request out to the FusionReactor servers at FusionReactor.com, and related servers, and it's going to ensure that this license key is valid and it's associated with your trial, that sort of thing. If you don't have internet access, obviously this won't work. And for some of you, you won't be able to do this. That will be what's called manual activation. We'll come back to that in a bit. But again, let's just go down the route of simplest typical implementation. So we would just do the full installer, not a manual installer. And we'll do this automatic activation, not a manual activation. Because for most people, they'll just put that license key in here, click apply, and they're done. And we're into FusionReactor. Now, unfortunately, this is where some people don't read the screen, don't notice anything from, anything on the website, and they think they're done. And they look over here and go, it's interesting. It's got 3 buttons, and those don't look really interesting. And what is all this stuff about? Well, no, here's the problem. This is not FusionReactor monitoring your application server like ColdFusion or Tomcat or Jetty or Rilo or Lucy. This is not that. This is Fram. This is running in that other service at that port 8087, and its job is to manage any implementations of FusionReactor in such applications or application servers. Okay, and so for now there are no applications or application servers, and it's also saying we haven't run a scan. And there's a feature here to scan your system to find anything that can be monitored. So I've said back earlier the things that FusionReactor can monitor, and I could show you in the docs also the details of what it can monitor. And the point is that if you click this button, it will start again at my C drive, in my case Windows, and go up to 2 levels deep, and that's okay. This will be very fast. In fact, while I'm talking, I'm just going to click the button so you can see how fast it is. And if you were on a Linux box, you could start it at the root, or you could start it at opt, or whatever you wanted to do. The point is you can tell it, and it's really fast, even to go 2 levels deep across my entire C drive. In my case, it found only ColdFusion. Now, I do happen to also have Wildfly as an example of a Java application server. I'll come back to that in a minute. But again, let's stick with the simplest route, which is for most people, if they have a supported application, when you do that scan, FusionReactor finds it. Now, I've seen some people maybe running at resolutions where they couldn't see below this screen, and they just kept seeing this, you currently have no applications, and they misread that to think that there was nothing they could do. But if they scroll down, they'd see that, oh yes, the scan had found things that FusionReactor knows how to monitor. Again, if I'd installed Rilo and Lucy and various supported versions of Tomcat and Wildfly and JBoss, they would all show whatever I had. They would have shown up. That's the beauty of this scan feature. It's going to find whatever can be monitored. And if there's something that I have that's not listed, I can also add it. And that's what I referred to earlier as a manual, another aspect of manual installation. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But here we are again. Let's just talk about, for most people, and I know if you, besides having to repeat some things because we lost the audio, we're just talking about a minute from the time you go to the website, download the installer, run it, till you're at this point, and you click the scan button, and it says, okay, here's what can be monitored. So while we had to talk about it for a bit, and a little longer because of the problems, this really is just a 1-minute job to get to this point. So now we're at this point, and here's where what we're about to do will, in a moment, restart whatever we want to monitor. So if we're going to monitor, in my case, ColdFusion, in a moment we're going to get to the point where it's going to restart it. So far nothing has restarted my application server. I've just installed FusionReactor, that's all. But there's a button over here, a plus sign, and that's to install FusionReactor into this instance. Now before I go on, if I'd had multiple versions, I could check on the different ones that I wanted to install with this checkbox, and then come up here and click the plus sign and install it into all of them. But I don't need to do that because I only have one, so I'm just going to click this. And you can do that for changing and deleting them later as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do this. So this is the second part of the installation. You've got to do this second part. Now this second part is what's going to configure that application server to be monitored. And so FusionReactor has made some selections for me, which are generally okay. You can change them if you want to. The instance name is not really important, but if you wanted to change it to something meaningful to you, you could. It's only shown to you. The port, again, the Fram ran at 8087. This is picking 8088 as the next available port in that order, and that's okay. And if it was already taken, it would have picked 8089. But the point is, this is going to be a separate port, not the 8087 that Fram's listening on. It's going to be a separate port that FusionReactor running inside of your application server will be running on. And so just to back up, yes, when you install FusionReactor, you're actually implementing it inside of your application server. That's why it has to be restarted. And it's going to run from inside of it, and that's because it can get access to great information from inside of it. Now, if some of you say, well, hold on, I wanted it to be monitored from the outside. There's a feature of FusionReactor that can monitor it from the outside by talking to this FusionReactor that's on the inside. So you have to implement FusionReactor into the application server. No way around that. And it's a Java agent for those who are into that sort of thing. It's a very simple, straightforward thing. And in fact, it's only going to make one modification to one line of code in all of your application server. So if you ever wanted to take it out, you can use the interface to remove it, but you can also just edit that one line and take out that one argument that refers to FusionReactor, restart it, and you're back in business. But let's not get too deep in the weeds here. The point is you're just installing it for the first time. You're going through these screens. This listen on all addresses, it's what does this FusionReactor interface, what IP address does it listen on? And by default, it listens on all. You could pick ones if you wanted to. This address can be confusing. This is what will be shown on this screen behind here when this is done. What screen, what URL is going to be shown? What IP address is going to be shown? That's all. It's all addresses. I could get to it any way I can get to this machine, but this IP address, or which you can choose, will be shown on the screen in the background. For some of you, you might want to change it to some other IP address, or you might want to change it to this 127.0.0.1, or you might want to leave it as a public IP address. I'll leave that for you to debate, and you can click on these buttons and get little pop-ups to understand more about some of these things. Now, this is important too. By default, FusionReactor would be available on your external web server in a way that I'll show you in a bit how to do it, but it would be available unless you told it, no, I don't want to do that. And you might want to say, no, I don't want to enable FusionReactor on IIS or on Apache. I don't want to get to it through those. But the default is you can. And that can be helpful because maybe you can't get to this port 8088 from off your box because of firewall issues, but you want to get to FusionReactor, and you'll use its authentication to enable you to secure getting to it. So again, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Just know that that's an option you can choose to disable if you want to. And then again, you're asked for a password. Now this password is a different prompt than the earlier one. That was to get into FRAM. This is going to be to get into that 8088. And again, you could pick whatever you want. It could be the same one that you did before. You could use the same one as your administrator for your app server, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. It's your choice. Now this FRAM dashboard, that's the thing I was just referring to. There is a capability for this feature in FusionReactor Enterprise and above to have what's called a dashboard, and that dashboard can have one or more servers on it displayed, and those are talking to the FusionReactor in each of the instances that you've said you want to watch from the dashboard. So this is asked during the install because the trial is an enterprise, actually it's an ultimate edition. The trial is an ultimate edition that includes enterprise, so you get this option. If you were running the standard version of FusionReactor, you wouldn't even have the enterprise dashboard. So for some of you who know you're going to be buying standard, this really doesn't matter whether you say yes or no. You won't have that enterprise dashboard once you put in your standard license key. But we'll just move on. Yes or no, it doesn't matter really. And then depending on how you've implemented things, this is detected that I have Cold Fusion. Remember, I'm looking at Cold Fusion. It could be Tomcat, Rilo, JBoss, whatever. It knows that I'm running it as a service. It knows that under the covers, the way the configuration of Java for Cold Fusion is done through a JVM config file, it says I'll automatically configure that. That's the one edit that will be made. And again, FusionReactor knows about your application. It's figured that out, and it's offering you these options. You could change them, but for most people, you don't need to change it. And you would say, yes, I want to go ahead and restart it because I want to do this now. If you didn't want to do it now, I don't know if you could say no and do it later. I think it would stop it and leave it stopped, is my recollection. But anyway, so this will, in a moment, once I say go ahead and proceed, it will restart Cold Fusion. So the next screen will confirm everything I picked and says I will restart my application. So I'll go ahead and do that. I happen to be running Cold Fusion on this server, and so we can come over here to Services, and I'll find Cold Fusion, and I'll hit F5. And we see there it is stopping and stopped, and in a moment it'll be back up. I know some of you, your application servers don't go down that quickly. And if for some reason it took a really long time to go down, sometimes this screen will pop up saying, hey, I couldn't get it to stop. You might find if you come over here and look at, in the case of Windows, look at services, you may see it finally does stop. And you could started, and this will have made its modification. But anyway, this screen in the background is going to go away in a moment on its own. I'm not really touching it. This is now back up. FusionReactor is starting up inside of it, and as soon as it's detected that it's up and running, there you go. It just refreshed on its own. And so we're still on the instance manager. We're still in the Fram instance, but down here we can see the link that is now available for this running version of this application server, Cold Fusion in my case. And this link, if I click it, in most browsers will open a new tab. Some it'll open a new window. The point is it's going to open up and show us that FusionReactor running inside of that instance. Now again, I chose to do IE. It was just being a little bit flaky, but there it is. It's opening another tab. And the password, remember I put in that password previously, and I'm in. And it's already activated because the Fram instance was activated. I'm going to repeat this point. Here's 8087. This is the Fram with only 3 buttons, and then here's 8088 with many buttons. And that's the real thing that you use to watch FusionReactor. So many people miss that step. They don't get this second thing in here, and they don't get the benefit of FusionReactor until they get this in here. And this also tells you the version you're on. And we could go over more things later. Again, I don't want to leave getting into FusionReactor for later. In the time remaining, I want to talk about some of the subtleties of some other variations. So back to the browsers. And in fact, let me just get no questions since earlier. So we did a full installer, and I was apparently muted while I was pointing this out, so I want to repeat the point. You've got different installers for different OS versions and bit levels. And then there's this manual install option where you just get this jar file and put it in a particular directory and make modifications yourself. Well, I'm going to show you how to do that because I actually happen to have Wildfly running, and because of something about the particular Wildfly that I'm running, FusionReactor didn't detect it. You remember, it didn't find it, but there it is. And it doesn't matter whether it's running or not. I didn't have it running, but it doesn't matter whether it's running or not. It should have detected it, but it didn't. And so if you ever have a situation where you find that something you're trying to run doesn't get detected, you could manually configure it yourself. And I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that. And in fact, I want you to see that there's documentation for it here. And in fact, let me show you how to get to the documentation. We were looking at the Internet Explorer was my display of FusionReactor. Up here in the top left corner, on either the Fram instance or the CF instance in my case, there's a FusionReactor menu, and there's a help. And when you choose help, it opens a new tab, takes you to the docs, and again, remember this is in IE. I'm going to stop using that because that is annoying. And I know you can turn it off, but I just want to show you that that would launch the help. And there's all these manuals, all kinds of different manuals. You should definitely come and read these later. But there's an installation guide. And in the installation guide, it talks about the full installer, and it talks about manual installation as well, and console versus UI installation. So I'm going to go back over to my Chrome where I was looking at this before, and again, here's the different installers. And then there's also discussion right under the full installer of the single jar manual installation. So again, most of you wouldn't need to do this, but if some of you needed to implement FusionReactor into something that didn't show up, like I said, you could maybe want to monitor Solar or Confluence or some app server that wasn't listed and wasn't detected. You probably can still monitor it, you just have to do things manually. And there's a video here that walks you through it, but I'm just going to quickly show you that there's an explanation. You go get that FusionReactor jar, and then if you're going to use the Ultimate Edition and its production debugger, you have to also get the native libraries. And it tells you how to find them and where to get them. And then we're going to go through a process of creating a directory where FusionReactor is going to run this instance. Now, we didn't need to do this for the automatic install, but for the manual install, we'd need to create a directory, in my case, under C FusionReactor instance, and I'll give it a name, and I'll call it Wildfly. So let me go do that now. So I'm going to go to the FusionReactor directory and go to instance, and for now all I've got is the Fram instance that was put in at installation, and then the C Fusion one that got created by the automatic process of detecting the instance. But now I'm going to go ahead and do a new folder, and I'll call it Wildfly. Doesn't really matter what you call it. And in that folder, I want to put those files that were just talked about there. And we can get them from the front page of the here as well. So here's the FusionReactor jar, and I'll go ahead and save that. And I'll put it in that FusionReactor instance wildfly directory. Hold on, I just noticed that when I right-clicked it, it didn't do what I thought it was going to do. So I'm just going to click it, and it's going to offer to download it. There you go. And I'll copy it from that download. And then if I want the native debug libraries for the production debugger, same thing. I click on that, and I get a zip of those, and I'll say go ahead and keep it. All right, so now I'm going to go to the downloads. And again, I know this is for some people, you're not going to need to do this. So just keep in mind that for most of you, we'll only have spent 3 to 4 minutes to get to the point where we are. But for those who have to do a manual install, we wanted to cover that. So here's the FusionReactor jar that got downloaded, and I would just copy it or move it, whatever is appropriate for you, into that directory. In my case, again, the FusionReactor instance wildfly that I created. And then if I want to do the production debugger, I would just go open that zip here, the debug libs zip, and whatever version I'm on. So this is for Linux, and this is for Windows, so I'll go ahead and copy that and put it in that directory as well. So again, that's discussed in the documentation. I know some of you may have gotten lost there. It's really not difficult. You're just creating a directory, copying the files into that directory, then you stop the application server if it's running, and then you find where, for that application server, the JVM arguments get stored. And JVM arguments are typically going to look like -Java agent and a path to that jar. And then there's a -agent lib, agent path, sorry, and a path to that, in the case of Windows, that DLL. Okay? So if we want those things, we want to put those in there. Now they show an example in the docs here of how to do it in Tomcat, but I actually have Wildfly. And I want you to know that there is documentation of the different platforms, and there's a link to it, but I've already got it open as another tab, and it's called Application Server Examples. And it's got links to doing this in Tomcat and ColdFusion and Glassfish and Lucy and Rilo. As I continue down, it's got Wildfly. So in the case of Wildfly, it tells me I want to find the Wildfly bin folder, and if I'm doing the standalone, which is what I'm doing, I open the standalone conf. Actually, it's the conf.bat. I think there's a slight difference depending on certain versions that you got, but in my case, it was the standalone conf.bat. And you add a link to those in that file, and they show you what it typically looks like, and we'll see in a moment when I look at that file, it looks like this Java ops equals, although since it's a batch file, it's a little bit different. But anyway, I've already got it open over here. Standalone conf bat in the case of the Wildfly version I have. I just added this comment down at the bottom, and then I followed the pattern up here where it typically said set the Java ops to whatever they are plus this. Set the Java ops to whatever they are plus that. This is to enable different features. Well, to enable FusionReactor, we set the Java ops to Java ops plus this path. And I went ahead and typed this in already earlier, and I just would copy and paste that value from the screen, put it in here, point to the right path, point to the right folder, and make sure the port is the right one for whatever I just implemented. And then same with the agent path. And that's it. Having done that, if I now go start my Wildfly, we can see right there FusionReactor, the debugger has been implemented. We can see there's the Java agent. So we know from the screen already that things are going to get started okay. There's the references to FusionReactor. And in a moment, I'll have it up, and I'll just show you here on another tab in the browser first that I have Wildfly running. I think it's at 80, 90. It wasn't quite up yet. Oh, I know what it was. Sorry. 8088 is already taken by the ColdFusion one that I just did. So I need to make it 8089. My bad. And it's telling me there that there was a Java bind address already in use, so that was my mistake. And I had said specifically watch for the port, and in my brain I was thinking 8088 because we had just seen that for the cold fusion one, but we need to pick another one because 8088 is already taken. So I'll just make it 8089 right there. Just make that 8089. And then I'm glad I experienced that because you would have copied that value from the screen and pasted in there, and you could have the same dilemma. So there you go. That's it. I saved it, and now I'll run it. And again, apologies for those who don't need to go through this. I know we're taking about a 10 to 15-minute diversion for this manual installation, but it helps also for you all who did the manual and automatic installation to understand that all FusionReactor does in your application server is edit the underlying Java configuration to put in that Java agent and agent path. That's it. So if you ever wanted to take it out, you just take it out yourself, remove it. In the case of Cold Fusion, remove it from the jvm.config. And if you're using Rilo or Lucy, you can read the docs about how you modify the underlying Tomcat configuration. So that's that. I should find now that my Wildfly comes up. Which browser am I in? Sorry, I know I did this yesterday. There you go. Well, I'm not going to bother trying to get up that, but I'm just going to try to go to the FusionReactor, which again was at 8089. Just a moment. Somebody's sending me a text. Maybe I've missed something that's not obvious to me. David, I know it was 8089. I was trying to show Wildfly running. It runs by default at 8090. I was trying to demonstrate that that was running itself, separate from FusionReactor. Here's FusionReactor running, so we know it's running. And 8089, there it is, 8089. Now I haven't experienced this before. Now again, I'm in IE, so it could be a problem with IE. But let me just change it to 127.0.0.1. Yeah, that was it. I'm not going to try to figure that out, but the point is it can be gotten to as 127.0.0.1. 8089 is the port that I configured Wildfly to be listening to for FusionReactor. I was talking about 8090 earlier because that's the default port that I believe it's 8090 that Wildfly listens on for its web server. I just wanted to show you that Wildfly was running, but here's now FusionReactor running inside of Wildfly, and it's by default when you manually configure it, it chooses that option to not be available to the external web server. So I had to use this port to get to FusionReactor's web server, and that's a little subtlety I didn't explain. But when you implement FusionReactor and you don't choose, or whether you choose to use the external web server or not, by default, FusionReactor implements its own web server inside your application server. Yes, that 8088 in the case of Cold Fusion is another web server running inside of Cold Fusion, or in my case in Wildfly, this 8089 is another little mini web server bundled inside of FusionReactor, bundled inside of your JVM. Doesn't take up much space, don't worry about that, and none of FusionReactor takes up much space. But anyway, here I am, first time getting in, so since I manually did it, it didn't have a prompt for me to put in the password, so it's asking me to put in the password, and boom, I'm in, and now this is FusionReactor watching my Wildfly. Now I want to move on. We spent too much time backing up because of the audio problem. I want to get back to what we were planning to cover in the presentation. So we've done the downloading, installing, we've done the automatic and manual options. I want to explain to you that when you do the free trial, it lasts for 14 days. And at the end of the 14 days, listen, at the end of the 14 days, it just stops doing its thing. It's not going to break your application. It's not going to break your Cold Fusion or your Tomcat. It's not going to stop things from running. It's just going to stop doing what it does. It'll still be there, but it just won't do anything. Now, if you ever come in and add a license key, and you'll see a prompt like we just saw, we'll see a screen much like this screen was here. It'll be not logged in, but it'll be like that previous screen, and it'll be asking me for a license key because it's not activated, and it won't let me log in. It won't show me any buttons because it's a trial that's expired, but it'll be a screen on which I can add that license key, and if I add it, boom, it automatically right then and immediately converts it into a running version of FusionReactor. So that's easy to do. I mentioned that there's different versions of the installer. And then for Linux folks who are on a console, and also Windows folks in a console, there are console versions, and the online help talked you through the installation guide would show you the screens of doing the console installation. If it detected that you were in a console environment, you would be led through a console-based installation. Pretty much all the same questions, but just all console-based. All right, so quickly about the activation. So we just did an automatic activation. I was on the web. The server that I implemented it on was on the web, and therefore it was able to automatically reach out to the FusionReactor servers, take my license key, and confirm that it was an appropriate one, and enabled my running FusionReactor. But if I didn't have access to it, then I'd have to do a manual install. Now, I'll just tell you that there is, again, documentation of all that, but just bottom line is there was a screen that appeared. In fact, let me go ahead and log out, and we'll see that screen. I don't log out very often. I'm forgetting that. Right, it's up here under FusionReactor logout. If I was on this screen and it was not able to do the activation, or if I was on that earlier screen and I wasn't able to do the activation, I would be seeing a screen here that would give me a URL to something called the portal. And I would just take that link to the portal and open it up in a browser where I did have internet access. And there would be on the screen also a button to generate a big string. I can't demonstrate this right now, and we're running out of time anyway. But the point is, and again, it's all in screenshots in the documentation, but there'd be a screen full of numbers, and you'd copy and paste that out of this FusionReactor, which doesn't have access to the internet, take it over to a monitor or another machine, remote, whatever, where you do have access to the internet, and you'd go to the portal, and you'd pop in that long string, and you'd be given a new string on that other browser, and you take that string and come back here to this FusionReactor, and there'd be a field in which to drop that string in and hit submit, and now it will be activated. So that's a manual activation. Sounds complicated, really is pretty easy, and again, there'll be screens guiding you to it, and there's online documentation explaining it. And we've already talked about configuring instances and the configuration options and the browsing of it versus the 8087 versus 8088. Now, as far as browsing it via an external web server, I'll just show you really quick. If I come out to my browser, like this one is on the internet, if I go to my website, carehart.org, I actually have FusionReactor running on that server, but I wouldn't be able to get to port 8088 from off the server. This is running on a VM somewhere. Happens to be a Windows Azure VM, for those who care. And it doesn't have access. My firewall doesn't let somebody from the outside get to any ports. But here's a little trick. If you look at the URL for FusionReactor where you are successfully able to log in, it looks like this. It says FusionReactor/findex.htm. That's what it usually looks like. Now, you don't have a FusionReactor directory anywhere, and there's no file called findex.htm. These are all just implemented as what are called servlet filters or in the agent path, the Java agent, but let that go. But the point is, that's what the URL should look like. If I want to get to my FusionReactor on my server, I can just paste that in. Now, that's still not going to work. If I hit enter, it's still not going to work. But here's the trick, and this is in the documentation. If I just, since it's a Cold Fusion server, if I just add .cfm, I'll make sure you guys saw that. So I took that URL, the path that I should have used, but I've added .cfm. Since my server is a Cold Fusion server, this would work with Lucy and Rilo. If I've got my web server, in the case of carehart.org, configured to pass CFM requests into Cold Fusion or Lucy or Rilo, or if you're on Java, there's an equivalent for Java and other environments, but the point is, here's the one for Cold Fusion. I've just added .cfm. Again, there is no FusionReactor.cfm. Don't worry about that. But that's going to just be passed by the web server to Cold Fusion, and FusionReactor is running inside of Cold Fusion. It's going to intercept that request and go, oh, you want to see the FusionReactor interface, and I'll hit enter, and boom, there's my FusionReactor interface. So that's a real nice tip for those who maybe need to access FusionReactor from off of their boxes. You can do that. Okay, so it's your domain or your IP / FusionReactor, in the case of Cold Fusion.cfm. And again, it's in the documentation. Now, we had hoped in this presentation to also go over basic features. We've run out of time. I don't want to try to delve into even any of them, but I'll just tell you that there are many. And again, there's ample documentation, there's videos, there's other webinars, which will get into this in more detail. And perhaps next time when we give this talk, we will have that time that we'd set aside to have just even several minutes to be able to do such demos. But you should definitely look into the metrics, web metrics, how it handles requests, how it does database analysis, features called relations, applications view, watching requests across apps and across time, how you can monitor memory usage, and so much more. And then I wanted you to be aware that was all I'm going to do, maybe in 5 or 10 minutes. We just lost that because of the audio problem. But then I would also tell you that there's much, much more to FusionReactor, and it's covered in other resources and in other webinars. So for instance, the Debugger, wonderful tool in FusionReactor 6 Ultimate, and the Profiler, also brand new and wonderful and useful. We don't have time to get into them. Experience monitoring, I mentioned this about watching the traffic from the server down to the browser, the time on the network, the time in the browser. That's called user experience monitoring. It's very easy to add, and there's a whole section on all of these in the docs, and there's videos and other things to help you with some of them. So I'll just move through these to say that each of these are in their own right valuable tips, features that you should learn about and understand. I want to leave that as the bottom line here, is make sure even in this introductory class you take the time to understand these things to get the most out of FusionReactor. We just don't have time in an hour to go over all of them, and I knew we wouldn't. So as far as the other webinars, I'll show you that in a moment. I also want to mention before I go that there is an upcoming new version of FusionReactor called FusionReactor Cloud, and FusionReactor Cloud is not about you being in the cloud or your servers being in the cloud. It's about FusionReactor being supplemented with a cloud-based implementation that Integral, the makers of FusionReactor, will manage, and it'll provide an alternative way for you to get information about your server, whether it's in the cloud or not, and it'll be stored in a database on the web, secured, only seen to you, and you'll be able to look at things over time. It'll be able to show you different perspectives than can currently be shown within FusionReactor itself. So that's a new tool coming out in the near future called FusionReactor Cloud. As far as the other webinars that are coming up, and really the next one to follow after this one would be configuring FusionReactor for action. That is, what configuration changes can you make in FusionReactor, and that you've got it installed and you understand the basics of how to use it. What might you want to configure in it to give you even more value and to help you really get to the, remember we said earlier, what was its purpose is to help you solve problems, to help you understand, is your server okay, is your application okay, are your users okay? Some of that's provided in the interface out of the box, and some of it, there's things that you can configure that will help you tremendously. So that'll be its own webinar coming up in a couple of weeks. Then in the future, probably January, we'll have a different one called Troubleshooting Identifying Issues with FusionReactor. So now that you understand the basics, now that you understand how to have it basically configured, how can you use that information to really troubleshoot specific common issues? Okay, so we'll talk about that in a future one. And then, because I mentioned in passing, there was the Debugger and the Profiler in Ultimate, and there's some other features of Ultimate. They really are worthy of their own presentation. So we'll have another one called Getting the Most Out of Ultimate. All right, so you can keep an eye on the FusionReactor webinar page to learn more about that as you found this one. And I just want to point out as well, you're going to have some questions that we won't get to today, perhaps, or you don't want to ask publicly. So first, I've said it again over and over, go to the FusionReactor website for the downloads, for docs, videos, tech notes, forums, public forums where folks like myself, other users of FusionReactor, and the engineers are all there to help each other out. It's a wonderful resource. And you can also just directly send emails of sales-oriented nature to the sales address, and of technical issues to the support address. And unlike a lot of companies where the support address is a black hole and you never know if you'll get an answer, you always get an answer from the FusionReactor support address. Now, they'll try to help you. There may be a point at which they have to say, hey, this is getting beyond what's suitable for free support, but you'll be amazed that you'll often, and certainly if it has to do with getting FusionReactor running or learning how to use a particular feature, being pointed to resources, you'll get an answer. All right, and then there's also a phone number for those that want to speak to someone, especially for sales-oriented, not support, but for sales-oriented questions. You can reach out to that number, and they'll look forward to helping you. All right, so with that, I want to turn it over now to questions in the remaining minutes. So let me look at the questions pod and see if any have popped up. There weren't any earlier when I looked about 10 minutes ago. I see. Nope, still none. So anybody else with any questions? I'd be glad to know that I've answered most of them already. And I'll say again that we will repeat this if you have anybody that you wanted to see it and they missed it perhaps because they only saw that German number. We'll fix that, of course. They should have been able to get to a U.S. number. Obviously, some of you did because you're listening. And hopefully we figure out the chat thing too. Okay, well, it doesn't seem to be any questions, and that's okay. I hope that I've just answered them all for you. And I guess with that, I'll say then have a good day. We're right at the top of the hour. Good timing. I'd hope we've finished around this time, but gotten just a little bit further, but we'll do that in the next ones with that little bit more time that we'll have. So until then, look forward to the next presentations. Talk to y'all later.